We're busy looking at different views on the image of God. Now, these views tend to be pitted against one another, as if you have to choose one or the other. But we think that when properly considered, they fit together into a single comprehensive vision for what it means to be in the image of God. So what we're doing is we're looking at each of them individually, and then in a discussion video after our third lesson, we'll be thinking about how they fit together into that single vision. In the previous lesson, Matt took us through the substantive view. And so in this lesson, we're going to move on to the next view called the relational view. Now, as the name might suggest to you, the relational view sees relationships as being at the core of what it means to be made in the image of God. Broadly speaking, we can think about this in terms of two kinds of relationships. They are vertical relationships, which exist between God and humanity, and they are horizontal relationships, which exist within humanity, between one human and another. A full account of the relational view requires that we pay attention to both of these components, the vertical component and the horizontal component. So what we're going to do in this lesson is we're going to look at each of them individually, and then we're going to think about how they fit together and see how philosophy can help us in our thinking about that. So let's start thinking about the vertical relationship. In the creation week in Genesis 1, humans are created on day 6 alongside the rest of the land animals. And so in this way, we're very much like the other animals in creation. The thing that is called out that distinguishes us from the rest of creation is that humans alone are made in the image of God. Now, one of the clearest ways in which humans differ from the rest of the animals in creation is that we can have a relationship with our Creator, a personal relationship. We can even go further than this and say that having a personal relationship with our Creator is part of the purpose of what it means to be a human being, what it means to fully live out human life. Now, we can see this partly in the first pages of the Bible, where Adam and Eve are created to be in this special relationship with God in the Garden of Eden. And while humanity doesn't continue living in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve aren't alone in being in having this relationship with God. As we read on in the Bible, the relationship between humanity and God continues to be at the forefront of the biblical story. God reveals himself to us. He makes covenants with us. He listens to our prayers. He holds us accountable for our actions. He pleads with us to turn back to him when we sin, and he welcomes us with open arms when we do turn back to him. That relationship culminates in the biblical story with Jesus, and it continues all the way until the end, when we're given this picture of this perfect relationship that humanity will have with God that's going to come with the new creation. Now, unlike what was taught in many of the cultures around the time of ancient Israel, this vertical relationship between humanity and God isn't something unique to a specific subgroup of humanity, like the king or the priests. Rather, it's something that each person has, regardless of their place in society. John Hammett notes that because God cares for the well-being of all of his creation, it's reasonable to think that this vertical relationship is available even to those whose disabilities or underdevelopment would hinder a fully fledged relationship with other human beings. He says the following: "Only God knows what is absolutely necessary for a relationship with him. Only God knows how to deal with the spirits of the mentally challenged, children, those with Alzheimer's, and those with other disabilities. We may affirm that each person has the capacity for a relationship with God because we believe God has the capacity to reach every human spirit. The possibility that God can establish relationships with humans in exceptional ways, in exceptional circumstances, should be left open." Now, fundamentally, the biblical doctrine of the image of God is that every human is made in that image, regardless of their place in society or their mental capabilities. So then, it stands to reason that if a relationship with God is part of that image, then God would ensure that each person has it, regardless of their circumstances. This is a privilege for each human being, but it also brings with it a responsibility for each of us to use that capacity to the best of our abilities. We each need to cultivate a relationship with God, regardless of how religious our family is or how religious our community happens to be. Consider, for instance, that even in the Old Testament, where God was physically living among Israel and had a relationship in the temple and had a relationship mediated between him and his people with the priests, it was still up to each person to bring their own offerings and prayers to God at the temple. So then, from a relational point of view, that's the vertical component of the image of God. Just as God knows himself, so too we, as his limited image bearers, can know him in our own limited way. But theologians have also noticed that there is a horizontal component to the image of God that fits together with this vertical component. We see a hint of this in the initial creation week when Genesis talks about the creation of humans. It says the following: "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.' So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth.'" Now, we're going to get to all this language of dominion over the rest of creation in the next lesson. But for now, what I want to draw our attention to is the corporate nature of the image of God that's pictured in these verses. In verse 27, when God creates humans in his image, he speaks about us in one collective noun, like humanity or mankind. And this is how many translations will translate it. This suggests that we together bear the image of God. This is confirmed in the next verse, in verse 28, when he speaks to all of us all together, telling us to be fruitful and multiply. And it is noteworthy that when this idea is first introduced in verse 26, God uses the plural when he says, "Let us make humanity in our image." In other words, the image itself is of something corporate or collective. Now, if humanity is going to bear the image of God together, then we'd better be able to form relationships with each other. And this is precisely what we have in mind when we talk about the horizontal component to the image of God. Now, it doesn't take much to see that humans are capable of much richer relationships than the other animals in God's creation. No other species can cooperate to form societies like we do, which build cities, develop technologies, work the ground to produce resources, and establish international economies. On a more personal level, it's undeniable that humans are capable of loving one another in ways that far exceed what other animals are capable of. But of course, with this higher capability for cooperation and for love, so too comes the possibility of greater corruption and cruelty. So, this goes to show that just like what we had with the vertical component, this horizontal component of the image of God is something that we have the responsibility to live up to and live out to the best of our abilities. Commenting on the corporate nature of the image of God, John Walton says the following. He says, "The status is expressed as corporate, since all people, by virtue of being people, are included. Consequently, we are not individually his images, we are corporately his image." That's all we're going to say about the horizontal component of the image of God. With the hindsight of all of Scripture, we could say that just as God in his triune nature has a community within himself, so too humanity as his limited image bearer has a community within itself. So we have these two types of relationship that together make up the image of God. There's the vertical and the horizontal. From a biblical perspective, these two ideas aren't disconnected from each other, but they go hand in hand. So consider the phrase that God routinely spoke through the prophets, that they will be my people and I will be their God. In this phrase, we see these two ideas being connected with one another. Together, Israel forms a people because they all belong to God. Or consider that the two greatest commandments are first to love God and second to love your neighbor as yourself. Or that the fruit of God's Spirit in us is to love one another and God. Or that we are empowered to forgive and show mercy to one another because God has forgiven us and shown us mercy. So from a biblical perspective, we want to say that the vertical and the horizontal work together as two parts of one image of God. But there does seem to be something of a tension between the two, which is briefly worth thinking about. The tension is this. The fact that each of us has our own capacity for relationship with God suggests that the image of God is something that each one of us has individually. But the fact that humanity as a whole bears the image of God suggests that the image of God is something that we have collectively. In other words, the vertical component pulls us towards the direction of individualism, whereas the horizontal component pulls us in the opposite direction towards collectivism. So, the question is it possible to hold on to both the vertical and the horizontal without one of these compromising the other? This is a question that philosophers have been wrestling with for almost as long as there's been philosophy, at least in the Western philosophy. They've grappled with it in the fields of politics and metaphysics, and I'm sure other fields. Matthew O'Brien explains it as follows. He says, "The attempt to navigate successfully the narrow strait between atomic individualism and organic collectivism has been a recurring theme in Western metaphysics from the time of Plato to the present. The organic collectivist holds that the most fundamentally real things are complete and sovereign human societies. On this view, individual human beings are merely cells of the social organism, with a nature, an identity, and an existence wholly dependent upon that of the whole. In contrast, the atomic individualist holds that individual human beings are the substances, with societies as mere aggregations or heaps. We can be pretty sure that there is some third option between these two extremes, because we can come up with examples of such things, even if we can't fully explain what's going on in these examples. To see this, consider something simple like a sports team, the South African rugby team, the Springboks. The team is a social entity made up of its individual members, and some of the facts about the team are reducible to just facts about those members. For instance, the team is in South Africa because each of its members are in South Africa, or the team is healthy because each of its members are healthy. Now, if all the facts about the team were reducible to facts about its individual members like this, then we would have a case of atomic individualism, where the team is just the sum of its members, or a heap of its members. But there are also facts about the team which aren't reducible in this way. So, for example, if the team signs up for a tournament, then this would be something that's independent of the individual members that make it up. To see this, imagine that it signs up and then each of the members gets sick, okay, and then they get replaced before the tournament actually begins. None of this requires that the team have to re-sign up or anything in order to be part of the tournament. The same initial sign up applies to the team as a whole when they get there. And so, as a social entity then, the team must be something that's more than just the sum of its parts. But it's not like when the individual team members join the team, they somehow lose their personal identity or their individuality, as would be the case in something like organic collectivism. To see these two things playing together, imagine that the team won the tournament that they signed up for. This victory belongs to the team as a whole, but at the same time, it's something that each of the team members participates in. By that I mean that they each have that one and the same victory, without having to divide it up into parts or distribute it amongst themselves. Somehow, the victory of the team is both collective and individual at the same time, without either destroying the other. Now, returning to the image of God, we can think of it in the same way as the victory of the team. Just as the victory belongs to the whole team, so too does the whole of humanity together bear the image of God. We do this by leveraging the horizontal relationship that we have with each other, to love one another and to work together. And together, we have a relationship with God, our Creator. But just as every individual team member participates in the victory of the team, so too does every individual human participate in the image of God. One person's vertical relationship with God doesn't diminish another person's relationship with God, as if he somehow needed to split his attention between these two people. So that's where we're going to end our discussion of the relational view of the image of God. We'll have more to say in our follow-up discussion videos, but what we've said so far suffices to show one way in which this view might be unpacked. To summarize, on this view, the image of God is made up of two components that go hand in hand: the vertical relationship between humanity and God, and the horizontal relationship that humanity has within itself. In order to fully live out the image of God, we need to love God and love our neighbor, with each of these reinforcing the other. God empowers us to love one another, and out of love for one another, we will spur each other on to love God.